I was just hiking with a friend in not far from here, and she came up with this title. She said, call it more than a Bunsen burner. I really like this title. So I thought I'll give it a try, because it is really more than, what you kind of expect a chemist to do. So let me see. I was asked to give a little bit more about my biography and, how I actually came about to transition into the nonprofit world as a scientist. And so I added a couple of slides to my regular talk. But what we are transitioning into is AIDS-Free Africa. AIDS-Free Africa is a nonprofit organization registered in New York. We're also registered in Cameroon. And the mission is to support Africans to produce and access pharmaceutical drugs. That is our core mission, although, as you will see in this talk, we do a lot of things. As a chemist, I love problems. I love to solve them. So if someone brings me a really juicy problem, I just can't say no. Sometimes my board of director gets really kind of like, oh yeah, we're doing that too. I say, yes, we're doing that too. So the vision for the organization is the way we started, which is Africa free of HIV/AIDS, to provide the world with the capacity to produce life-saving drugs as an expression of our commitment to peace, health, and human dignity. Part of this sentence actually comes from a United Nations General Assembly meeting in 2003, which is when I initially came up with the idea. It took me a couple of years to, found the organization. So we started in 2005. So who I am, for me, what I do is so normal that when people kind of listen to me and say, oh, wow, you're doing this, I'm sometimes really taken back, and I'm kind of like, well, that's normal. And, and some people tell me, no, that's not normal. That's not what most people do in their life. So, but that's what I do. And sometimes I try to figure out if there was anything in my life, in my background, that got me to where I am today. And I have to say, for me, being a child, I grew up in West Germany, but I'm not from West Germany. So for me, where the Berlin-Brandenburg Gate is, which the students today might not even know much about the history of Germany, but the Brandenburg Gate is sort of like, was for me always the symbol of where I came from, which is Berlin, which is not even where I come from. I came from Potsdam, which is about an hour and a half away from Berlin. But as a child, growing up in West Germany, that's what I thought I came from. So I always, and I think that's one thing that is really unique in my biography, that from the early years on, and that's when I was 3 years old, we left East Germany and fled to West Germany because they built the wall and, divided the country. So growing up, we never really thought much of ourselves as refugees. And we were certainly not refugees like you see when you look at, third world countries and, the United Nations building tent cities and, people just being very stranded, without much of a help. As East Germans, we were welcomed by the West German government, and we, as refugees, they had built whole cities for us. There were little buildings, made from wood, so they weren't tents or anything like that. But at the end, we were refugees. My father and his wife and the 2 children, my sister and me, we left East Germany with, according to my parents, with a passport and a birth certificate in our hands. That's all we had. So we really ended up, and we were 1.5 million people. So it's not just, 50,000 people. We were 1.5 million Germans who left East Germany and fled to West Germany. So my life is sort of like between, knowing that I came from somewhere where this gate is, to the day the wall came down. It's the Berlin Wall. In the picture below here, you see the people here sitting on the wall. This was all militarized zone, right, with shooting and all that stuff. So I have always had, you know, something in my biography that drives me towards populations who are in trouble and who are, you know, worth of doing serious efforts. So, so you know, in my life, if you ask me what my goals were, I really had only I had only 3 goals. Of course, the first one was to find my mother. My mom was left behind in East Germany, and I found her when I was 21 years old. And this picture, you see her. This is me here with that sports jacket on, and my mom is the small woman in the front. And the 2 women in the back are my sisters. The one behind my mom is my East German sister, Anne. And the other one is Karin, who was with me in West Germany. So the 2 of us grew up together. So we had our family divided by the wall, you know, so it was quite traumatic. So I found my mom. So, you know, checked off. Did that, done. So the second one was when I was 10 years old, the town where I lived in Kaiserslautern, they built this university. They stomped out this entire university, and it had 4 huge buildings, one for chemistry, one for biology, one for physics, and one for mathematics. And before they really opened it to the students, they opened the doors to the public. So they had sort of like an open house. And we went there. My father took us there, and I was 10 years old when that happened. And by the time we ended up in the library, which was gorgeous, old building with all dark panels and the lights, and then the books, right? It was just totally fascinating. So I stood there 10 years old, and I said, when I'm grown up, I'm going to get a doctorate in mathematics. And, you know, the adults were kind of like, oh, yeah, right. But from that day on, I literally calculated myself through math books, and I loved it, you know. So I became a chemist, but it's pretty close. You know, getting a doctorate in chemistry is still pretty good compared to mathematics. So I would say checked off, right? The last one is, you know, basically do good things and be happy. And, you know, with AIDS-free Africa, I was, you know, happy most of my life. As a chemist, I did wonderful research in insulin research, inhalable insulin, which is now actually on the market in the United States. You can inhale it and eat your food if you're diabetic, and do some other things. So, and then of course, you know, came AIDS-free Africa. And I'm gonna go into this one now. So how did I come up with running a nonprofit organization? I was working for the pharmaceutical industry for a long time, different jobs, made a lot of money. It was great. It was fascinating. And eventually I went back to school to get my doctorate. I was working as a master's with my master's in chemistry. And I went back and got my doctorate. And at that point, the question was kind of like, go I just back to the industry and do the same thing, you know, like on a PhD level, or what? So back then I thought I wanted to work for the United Nations. So this was sort of the beginning of the thought to do something international, go into other countries. Someone wants to be admitted. Here we go. So I went to the United Nations, and interestingly, they don't hire chemists. When they need something science related, they go to universities, they find a professor, and they say, here, you know, make the study for us, or write this report, or do whatever. So they really don't hire chemists. And you have to be a certain age, and you have to speak English and French. And my French has never really developed into anything. I already speak German and English. I figured that's enough. So my philosophy is, if you can't get a job, volunteer. So I volunteered for an international peace organization, which gave me to represent them at the United Nations. So I got my credentials and my ID, and I was listening to the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva at this time, who was telling us how, when the AIDS crisis started in the late 80s, early 90s, they broke the patents and produced AIDS drugs in the country. And Brazil, at that time, was the only developing country that actually got a handle on the AIDS crisis. It was really fascinating. The US pharmaceuticals were quite mad at them. You know, they tried to make their lives difficult for breaking the patents. But the US almost did the same thing with anthrax. When we had anthrax problems, the US was just about to break patents and produce stuff. So, you know, it goes both ways. But for me, I listened to the guy and I was kind of like, yeah, this is cool. We'll go to Africa and help them to produce AIDS drugs. And that is really the beginning of AIDS-Free Africa. That was in 2003. And it was so fascinating because from day one, of course, I told everyone, right? I told everyone whether they wanted to hear it or not. And I remember Paul Hartfield at the United Nations. He literally stopped dead in his track and he looked at me and he said, this can't be done. Producing drugs in Africa, never. I said, why not? Watch me. Right? So, you know, in my life, I found my mother, I got my PhD. I can produce drugs in Africa, right? What's the big deal? So I have pretty much a God-given idea that I can do whatever I want to do. So people always ask me why Cameroon, because one of my former professors from Kansas told me about some woman who knew something about Africa. Dr. MacArthur is a researcher, and she has a small TB research outfit in Bamenda in Cameroon. And when I told this lady what I wanted to do, she said, yes, come. So I had my invitation, and I also had an invitation to go to Kenya. But the Kenyans, I went to Kenya, but the Kenyans never really got the idea what to do with me. So I moved on to Cameroon, and the Cameroonians were kind of like, yes, doctor, we need you. So it became a pretty exclusive thing. We've worked in Cameroon almost, 99% of our efforts goes into Cameroon. And you see in the picture this little red triangle here in the middle of Africa on the west coast. This is Cameroon, right? And so we're wedged in between Nigeria in the west, Chad in the northeast, the Belgian Congo, which is now called the Central African Republic, parts of the Congo, and in the south, Gabon. So we got a lot of neighbors, which is good and bad. You know, the Central African Republic had a long 20-year civil war, so a lot of refugees came into the country. Chad at times has really problems, so they come from there. And the Nigerians find it easier to make business in Cameroon, so they come, but they usually run businesses which work pretty well. So, so you find a lot of other nations in Cameroon. It's a quite diverse country. It's the size, it looks small, but the size is like California. And it's this continent is huge, right? You can get the US in there, I forgot, 4 or 5 times. It's huge. In the size of California, but it has by now, the birth rate is enormous. So I think by now we're up to 26 million. When I first started, we were just 21 million people. So in those 15 years, we got 15 more million people. So the birth rate is quite high. Which they have plenty of making fun of us here in America, right? They always think I should have a few babies. I'm kind of like, I'm too busy. So our goal when we first got there was to help them produce AIDS drugs. And that turned out very fast. Within my first trip, I knew that this was not quite what was needed, because the Global Fund had been established just around that time when I got to Cameroon, and the Global Fund was basically the exclusive club to deliver AIDS drugs to every developing country and so on. So the AIDS drugs were actually there, but the other drugs were all missing. And I was kind of like, why do you have AIDS drugs and no antibiotics or painkillers? And they were kind of like, well, because the Global Fund gives us AIDS drugs, but nothing else. I'm kind of like, okay, fine. So, why produce something that they have? We right away gave up on it, and said, okay, we'll have to produce generic drugs, whatever we need. And of course, the idea was always to train people in the country. I was never much in favor of some of the models that send doctors to Africa and they do their thing and they come back home. I thought it would be much more useful to train the locals, to have their own. And the idea was always from day one that everything I have done in Cameroon in these 15 years is owned by the Cameroonians. We as an organization do not own anything, period, which is unusual. Most organizations go into developing countries and they build their building and they bring their own staff and they do their thing, almost kind of like next to the population. I have always lived in the middle of it, in the middle of the village, in the middle of someone's house. So when we started, we were all chemists. All 5 people in this picture are chemists. And he got the wrong name here. His name is not Maimunat. I don't know how this happened. This is the wrong thing. This is, he's from India. And this one here is Bill Suits. Bill Suits is of late. Bill Suits and his wife are the only 2 people I know who passed on COVID. That's today's reality. Our Bill is passed on. So 15 years later, the only 2 who are in this work is me and Elliot Bay. Dr. Elliot Bay is a chemist, and Elliot is my right-hand man, and we are there. So as you can see, we were all chemists, and eventually it became pretty clear that as chemists we know what we know, right? But to run a nonprofit organization, you really need a lot of different talents, especially the social media and all those things, which is for young people. And you can see this picture is quite dramatically different. There are the 2 chemists. This is Mamuna, who is a medical doctor, and she is from Nigeria. So she is from the continent. So she has, enormous insights that we need. And Caitlin is 22 years old. When she joined us, the board was saying, oh, she's 22, she's so young. I said, yes, that's good. Caitlin, she is our secretary and she's getting 2 PhDs right now. I don't know why you need 2 doctor titles, but she's getting 2. She's in Virginia at a school. She already has a master's in I forgot if it's biochemistry, something like that. And she wants to get her PhD in biochemistry and in public health. Why not? And, she writes everything what I need to have written. Arena is also, she's 23, married, just has a little baby boy and has a job. She lives in Spain. She's Spanish. And I asked her, I said, Irina, you have a job, you have a new baby, and you volunteering for AIDSfreeAFRICA. How do you, and she said, no, she says, Rolande, because of COVID, I want to leave this world to my son in a different way. I want to contribute and I want to, make the world better for my son. And I was kind of, okay. So Irina joined us. She has an MBA. She's a lawyer. And she came with this idea we're getting our own app. Up to this point when she came, I didn't really know much about apps besides using WhatsApp. But we're getting an app to educate people on malaria prevention program, especially, that I wrote a few years ago when I had malaria, which, is a normal thing. You go to Africa, you get malaria. It's kind of like, yeah, it's not a big deal. So this is my current board, and I love them, especially I love young people. It's, you know, it is, eventually I'm going to have to hand over the baton, right, to someone. Caitlin has, although she's only 22, she has been in Africa on mission 6 times. I'm kind of, how did you get that in? And she said, the day I turned 16, they allowed me to go, and I went. And then she went every year. So I'm kind of like, so she's actually, besides Mamuna being African, she knows more, you know. Elliot and Irina have never been anywhere close to a developing country. So we're having fun. Now, you know, you cannot just go in another country and say, oh, you know, I think you should do this or you need this and so on, right? You have to really figure out, does your idea actually make sense for what you want to do, where you want to do it, right? It's like the Kenyans. The Kenyans couldn't make any sense out of what I was saying, which was amazing, because they're lacking drug production just about as much as the Cameroonians. But in Cameroon, if you look at this chart, I don't think it's all that clear, but what it basically says in a nutshell is, it's not a problem of the drugs being too expensive or that the people cannot afford to buy them. The biggest problem, this big green slice here, means the drugs are just not there. You have to imagine that the African continent has about 1 billion people, right? And it's divided in I always mess this up, I think it's 53 countries. So in every country has their own regulations, their own borders, and so on. You know, it's not like the European Union where you have certain ideas of, you know, streamlining these processes. Nope. Every little country has their own little thing. So to import these drugs at the right time, at the right moment, at the right amount, to the right places, especially later on, I show you a couple of pictures how the roads look like, right? The transit in transportation in Africa is, for the most parts, very difficult. So I thought, especially once I studied this slide, I thought, you know, helping them to produce drugs, especially, you know, just the antibiotics, just the basic things. In Cameroon, we have cholera outbreaks. It's normal, right? We have cholera outbreaks. We don't have this in the United States anymore, but they have it. The first 50 people get treated because all you need is an antibiotic. But once the antibiotic is finished, right, used up, the rest of them just die. So, you know, look at us with our COVID. We're now at 230,000 dead people, right? And I'm kind of like, oh yeah, really? That's all? In Africa, in Cameroon, it's kind of like, we lose 60,000 people in 3 months in just one region. And that's only malaria, you know? That doesn't count typhoid and tuberculosis and AIDS, and especially malaria. Malaria is still the biggest killer. So 230,000 people is still kind of like, okay, fine. You know, that's what happens when you don't have drugs. So this here is a picture of a hospital, right? That's a normal hospital ward. There's a lady, and you can't see it well, but she is on a malaria drip. And in the next bed, this is her baby. The baby is fine. She just brought this baby. The baby is asleep. She just brought the baby because, you know, the women there, everyone carries a baby. You know, they always have babies. It's kind of like, and this is probably not the only child she has. You know, the ones who can already move around and walk, they're probably somewhere at home. So that's a typical hospital. And what I really want to show you is the pharmacy. This is how this is the pharmacy. Guys, this is the amount of drug this hospital had in the pharmacy. This is the entire pharmacy. There is nothing hidden behind. This is it. And those little red bubbles that you see is ibuprofen. Ibuprofen. You know, so they are not really, there are a few ointments and a few antibiotics, and probably, hopefully, somewhere, some malaria drugs. But that's it, right? So the access to medicine is just tremendous. So once I left them, I think you can see the difference. right? So we'll drop the whole load of drugs on them and kind of like, here, you know, it's, so we knew we were on the right track in terms of helping with this. This is the clinic from the outside, so it's not huge either. These are three of the nurses, and this gentleman here is Mr. Polycarp G. Believe it or not, he ran this hospital, right? Guess what he has? He doesn't even have a high school degree. What he had is a weekend course in delivering babies, and he had helped out in some hospital in Douala for some weeks, whatever, right? So this is the level of care. And this is not totally in the boonies. This place here is in Limbe, which is actually one of the few tourist towns, because it's on the ocean. So this is in a fairly affluent city, right? Small city. So the medical, care there is just absolutely, and Polycarp was good. What he really knew is he knew his drugs. I would go to him and I said, Polycarp, that lady in the bushes asked me, this is what's hurting her. What should she take? And he would know what and how much, and including myself. At some point, I got sick, and I didn't know it. I knew when I came to the United States, I had contracted MERS, which is a pretty bad infection. I mean, they slammed me with antibiotics like crazy once I came here. But Polycarp gave me the right stuff. It was just not enough, but so I don't have big holes in my hip because at least it eats in your body. It makes holes in. It's a bacterial infection, makes holes in your body. So so that's the level of care, right? And there are, so this is one other project we did with a company in Belgium, which is called Typotech. They are now better known because they belong to Johnson & Johnson. They merge, pharmaceuticals, they like to merge and all that good stuff. But at that time when I was dealing with them, this is a drug for oral thrush, which is a typical infection for HIV/AIDS patients. And we worked with them for quite some time and introduced it. It's miconazole based, which is kind of like an antifungal that's used for a lot of different things. But this particular drug was specifically formulated for that oral thrush for HIV/AIDS patients. So we worked on that for quite some time. And that was one of the few times the company paid us quite well to do this project, which, doesn't always happen. Most of them think we should be, godly helping people and just do everything for free. I'm kind of like, well, it costs money. So this is the Cameroon Baptist Convention, which is the Baptist church, right? It belongs to the church. And they have a place in Cameroon where they produce IV fluids and some ointments like eye drops and liquid. Before I came, what was generally produced was based liquid IV fluids. There were 3 companies that produced IV fluids, and the Cameroon Baptist Convention was one of them. And with the Baptist, I was able to talk to their accountant and get all the numbers and the budgets and the money, where the money flows, which way, which is very important, even when you're a nonprofit. Because, even as a nonprofit, you have to have enough money to run your operation, right? So we convinced the Baptists that it would be really to their benefit to work with us and to expand their production. So, Philemon Young was the prime minister at the time. He is no longer. He was in power for 11 years. Very interesting man. He was the ambassador to Canada for 20 years. So very much used to our side of the ocean. He loved it. He made me visit him every time I came to Cameroon, and we would, deal with business, and then he would just talk about Canada. And I think he really missed it quite a bit. Very smart man, very interesting man. I really enjoyed enjoyed him and the connection with him. So for my very first trip on, I met Kenneth Luko, who is a young Cameroonian who built this building that you see in this picture, and they wanted to start producing drugs. And I worked with these, there were three of them, the three main people. I worked with them for 3 years. We tried everything. We tried to find money with this, and I taught them, connected them, and it was just a fascinating time. If I enjoyed my 15 years, which I enjoyed most of it anyway, but the first 3 years working with Diamond Pharmaceuticals was really fascinating. Kenneth worked for the Catholics, and they never really wanted him to leave. So every time he made noises and said, "Oh, I'm going to run my pharmaceutical," they gave him more money and more something and this and that. So he never really quite jumped, because I told him, I said, if you really want to produce drugs, you're going to have to do this full time. These guys were always, "Oh yeah, doctor, once the production starts, I come and I sit in my office." And I'm kind of like, this is never going to happen unless you quit your jobs now. Come from the US to Cameroon, come from your Catholic job to Boya, come from your place in Bamenda, come to Boya. You guys have to be there and do it. It's not going to happen. So it never happened. This building is still standing there exactly like that. The one thing we did is we put in the floors. And but it was an interesting time of, for us to learn how business is done in Cameroon, and if you go in a foreign country, it's very, very different. And that's, what makes it fascinating to work there. Another person who is Dr. Giselle Tam. This lady is really my favorite because she started literally from the kitchen sink. And like the others, she started producing fluids, IV fluids, because that's somehow easier. Then she did syrups. When you deal with medications for children, syrups are much more useful because you can adjust the amount you give to the child, right? If you give a tablet, it's, for an adult and they assume you're weighing about whatever, 250 pounds or something. But for children, it really, especially with malaria drugs, you have to adjust the dosage, and with syrups, that's easier. And, little children, make them swallow a full tablet. They're kind of like, it's kind of like, doesn't. So she really had, from day one, the most persistent and logical and, one foot in front of the other. She is to this day, she is, in terms of how I think someone should start drug production and go about it, she certainly hit the mark right and left and up and down. We really like her work. So as a chemist, of course, I got my feet wet, right? I tried to figure out, the AIDS drugs at the time were free, but it was so expensive for people to get the AIDS drugs. And I was kind of like, why? They're free. Well, the diagnostic. Where they got them is the diagnostic. It was so expensive. In fact, when you see the price list in these little hospitals, the diagnostic for HIV/AIDS was absolutely through the roof. It was the top, thing. So we looked at it. We looked at the machine that they're using, and there is a liquid that goes through these analytical machines. And the U.S. Abbott Laboratories was selling that fluid, which was 99% water, a buffer and a stabilizer and an antifungal, for enormous amount of money. So we were basically shipping water from America to Africa. And I'm kind of like, So we looked at the patent, we analyzed it, we bought the chemicals, and here we were producing buckets and buckets and buckets of that liquid. I was so happy. That was really a chemist's feat, and right down on the topic of drug production. We were so happy. And this one here, although this looks pretty simple, just about five people and me in one room, but they belong to 3 different companies. These 2 guys are Meditech, there's Dr. Etame, and there are the Baptists. They did not want to get together. They had never met each other. they were so worried that they would sort of like, like we are worried about our patents and giving away trade secrets. They were kind of like, oh, the Baptists, they're so big, they're going to swallow me up. Oh, this guy wants to. Even the question who's hosting the meeting, right? Because the one who was hosting it, which was the Baptist at the end, because they have the most place, that they are going to be the big guy. It was so funny. They were so leery to get together. And by the time I got them all in this room, they were all talking to each other. Dr. Itame was writing the regulatories at the time. The Baptists knew that. These guys were a little bit, at the beginning of the whole thing. They were talking to each other. They forgot that I was there. It was perfect, right? So I got them all to talk to each other. I'm kind of like, oh. But it's like, pulling teeth. Man. Oh, you see, and once in a while, you have to get a little pat on the back. The American Chemical Society had been asked by the U.S. Astellas Foundation to give awards to scientists who do work in developing countries. So, and there are really just three of us. It was Joe Fortunak and I. Joe Fortunak works in Tanzania, and I call him my African twin, because he does almost the same thing that I do in West Africa. He does in East Africa. And the third person had nothing to do with Africa. He was just working on a device that could have been used in a developing country. So they had a hard time finding people to give this award to. So they discontinued it. They couldn't find any more people. And they're kind of like, oh, well, Joe and I, it's us, eh? So they are not. There's also Nina Duchnik. She's pretty good. So like I said, besides the drug production, we did a lot of other things. And my guy from that clinic, he wanted me to come to his village, which is called Isu, ESU. Villages are not necessarily small. The village has 40,000 people. And that's roughly because they never know how many there are. But it's huge, right? And this is the main road to get there. So imagine that guy is walking faster than that vehicle is driving, right? So can you imagine everything has to be transported? So get drugs there, hallelujah, right? So half of the time people were not even, they didn't care if they had to pay money or get it for free. They just wanted me to bring it, because the transport is half the problem, and half the cost. It costs quite a bit to transport stuff in a village. But we managed to build a small clinic there. This is Dr. Ildiko from Romania, which is about the poorest country in Europe. And I found it so fascinating. She volunteered and she came for several months at a time for several years. She knew everyone in this village. It was quite fascinating. She was really made for this job. And they just loved her. But she volunteered. She came on her own account. We, hired people. This young man is a technician. This picture is funny. You know what the story is? This woman sitting here, she's the Queen Mother. So she was a big person, right? She was in that whole village, someone you looked up to. She wanted me to treat her. She said she had a pain and she wanted me to treat her. Well, I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot treat people, right? And I told the village chief, I said, Albert, I cannot treat her. You know that. I'm going to get in trouble. And he says, oh, doctor, just we tell Ancestus to consult her, and you just sit there and pretend that you are the one. I said, all right, fine. And I didn't say anything, right? So he did everything, and she would just, and I was just nodding, yes, fine. And there was really nothing. She had, basically back pain, but she was 80-something years old. You're supposed to have back pain in that age. So it was quite, you have to, navigate these, they're just different traditions, total different take on life. It's fascinating. So then came 2011, and Sinpharm opened its doors. This is a full-fledged pharmaceutical company. Their goal was to produce 40 different drugs, which is insane. You don't normally build a factory to make 40 drugs. You make, 2 or 3. That's more economic, because every time you make a new drug, you have to literally validate this whole factory and make sure there's none of the other drug, you don't want any cross-contamination. So you normally don't produce 40 drugs in one thing, but they had this idea. So the factory, of course, belonged to the Cameroonians, and this man here, Tabamba Sheleste, he is known in Cameroon, and they call him Cameroon's discreet billionaire. The guy has money. This factory was $24 million, which $6 million came from the German Development Bank. But most of the money came from Tabamba. The guy already owns two factories. He produces baby food and pasta. They call him the pasta king. So they were so proud of this factory. They showed me everything, and they really had everything. If you look at these pictures, this is like in the United States. This is a factory you could send here and people would say, yeah, that's it. GMP, everything, good manufacturing, GMP, good manufacturing procedures, everything in place. But of course, they always have some problems. Like this here is an HPLC. This is a machine that you need when you produce drugs. Before you release them to the public, you have to quality control them, right? We want to make sure the drug is what it's supposed to be. And they had only one machine, so they asked me to bring them another one. This is a $70,000 machine. And, oops, hang on a second, the machine is coming soon. But anyway, save the start. It's going to come in a second. Here is one of the products. This is called cotrimoxazole. That's an antibiotic, very common. It's a generic drug. And I actually went to a pharmacy and asked for it. And the pharmacist sold me the cotrimoxazole. And I asked her where it's coming from. And she looked at me and she said, from the US? I said, no, look at the package. It says Douala. It's a Cameroonian. And she was totally fascinated. That was one of the problems with Sinfarm. They were the best kept secret in the country. They don't have these PR machines that we have. So people just didn't know that this was going on. Here it is. So they asked me for this machine, and I found 4 of them in the United States. There is a guy in New Jersey who donated them to us. 4 HPLCs. Oh man, we shipped them to Cameroon. And this is the picture that you guys saw in the announcement. This is actually me at the university in Boya. These ladies were actually working on, did research on malaria, which is really a huge problem. Let me look at the time. Okay, good, we're almost there. So once we started shipping things, we got this ultrasound machine and medical supplies, and we send 40-foot containers. I collect everything that I can get my hands on. This was a deal I did with another US company. This was an HIV/AIDS test they gave to us and said, use it in Africa, use it in Cameroon, and tell us how it works. And as you can see already, the people all sit in their chairs, but they have no tables, right? So half of them spilled their little, devices. They had to spit in there and move this from there to there. And I told the company, I said, you gotta have to make it simpler and be aware that they don't have a table to, put it and have it stable. But they liked it. They liked it that they could spit and that they didn't need another, needle poking them to get blood. I had 16 volunteers over the years. These were my first 3. And they were also very successful. They were really fun. They were teaching or trying to teach. When you go into school and the kids, these little ones, they see your white face, they all just, the whole discipline is through the roof. And the teachers start chasing them and trying to get them to calm down. In Cameroon, they are really, I always tell people, we're 5 white guys. There are very few white people, and it's nobody really, it's not like in South Africa where, you have whole populations that are white. That's not the case in Cameroon. So everyone who is white basically just comes and goes. Very few people live there for a longer time. This is one thing I really love to share, because this is actually my house is here to the left. This is the front porch where I live. So all these people here, all the black faces you see, they came from Cameroon and visited. And actually, this one here, Thomas Chu, he lives in New Jersey. He's now an American. But these people, this is the village chief von Albert, in whose house I've, drunk a lot of wine and slept a lot of nights and ate jama jama and fufukon and all that good stuff. They came to New York. They came and visited. This is me in my African outfit. And it was just really such a fascinating thing, and for my, this is Richard, one of my board members, and this is my business coach and one of the volunteers, just to have them there and literally, be able to touch them. I mean, to say, oh, this is the person you always talk about. I say, yes, this is von Albert. And I just talked to him today. In these 15 years, we've been through a lot together. He's a fascinating man. When we came to his village, he gave me a hectare of land, which is about 3.5 acres, I believe. This is the land that's sort of like on the top of a dome shape, so I can look actually around on all 4 sides. That's just outside the village. This young man here, Paul, his secretary, he passed away. That's one of the things, it's kind of like people pass away so fast. He was such a young and strong and healthy looking man. And, one day, boom. And they never get into details what happened. We always say, oh, what did you die on? But in Cameroon, you're dead and that's it. So thank you so much for listening. Here are my ladies. They're always happy we sing together and, eat a lot of food. Thank you for listening.